We are delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. This session is part of the Urgency of Borrowed Time series. It is our pleasure to present today the Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson, in conversation with Raghu Karnad. Kim Stanley Robinson is considered one of the greatest science fiction authors. Beginning with a deadly human induced heatwave in India, his recent cli-fi novel, The Ministry for the Future, is a roadmap on which life on Earth can survive. Written through fictional eyewitness accounts, despairing yet hopeful in equal measure, it masterfully lays bare the challenges our planet faces. In conversation with Raghu Karnad, journalist and author of Farthest Field, Robinson shares his vision of the not too distant future. Kim Stanley Robinson is an American science fiction writer. He is the author of about 20 books, including the international best-selling Mars trilogy, and more recently, Red Moon, New York 2140, and the Ministry for the Future. He was part of the US National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers program in 1995 and 2016. His work has been translated into 25 languages and won awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards. In 2016, asteroid 72432 was named Kimrobinson. Raghu Karnad is a journalist and writer who is a recipient of Yale's Wyndham Campbell Prize for Nonfiction. He has been the chief of the bureau at thewire.in, a news site he helped launch in 2015. His book, Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War, was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2016. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications of the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson, in conversation with Raghu Karnad.
Hi, Stan. Good morning to you. Of course, we're speaking from opposite sides of the world. I'm in North India, and you're somewhere near the Pacific. Lucky you. And that seems very fitting for a discussion about this book, which is such a planetary novel. I don't think I've ever used that word to describe a novel before, but here it seems like the essential word. It doesn't just describe the scope of the action, but also the stakes. This is a book about how we as a planetary society can change and how we can rescue ourselves from this period of devastation that we are headed into. So many people have called The Ministry for the Future the most important book that they've read in recent years. I mean, that includes Ezra Klein, it includes my friend James Crabtree in Foreign Policy magazine. So I will just underline that, and I won't spend any more time introducing the book. Suffice it to say that it may be the most important book that you read this year or in coming years. What I do want to say at the outset is that when I read it, something jumped out at me that these other public figures and reviewers hadn't mentioned, and that was the heroic role that it offered to India from the beginning until the very end. So let me start by asking you about that, and we'll work our way from the particular to the general. Right on the first page, the book opens to a town in Uttar Pradesh, which is being hit by a heat wave, and an extraordinary one, what's called a wet bulb heat wave. Can I trouble you to tell us about what this kind of event is and what the scenario is that plays out in chapter 1?
Yes, and thank you for that. Although this is a rather horrifying start to a novel, I must admit. But when I read about the dangers of wet bulb 35, which is a combination of heat and humidity, you need both very high heat, very high humidity in combination, which is unusual, but getting more common because of climate change warming up the planet. At wet bulb 35, the human body cannot survive and dies of overheating And so air conditioning would become crucial. And if the power grid went down under the requirement of so much electricity, then anybody exposed to that temperature and humidity combination would quickly die. Now, there's many parts of the world that are susceptible to this problem as we go forward. Wet bulb 34 has been hit often, registered in the Persian Gulf and in the American Southeast and Midwest. So it's a widespread problem, but a particular place of danger is indeed the Gangetic Plain of North India, because of the Himalayas serving as a backwall to trap high air pressure, heat, and humidity. And so I chose to describe a town near Lucknow that is where this happens, and the power grid goes down and many people die. Now, this for me, I mean, I'm an American, I come from California. It felt like that it was possible that this could be seen as a kind of exoticism, or saying that this is a problem that could only hit the developing world, etc. There were various conceptual and moral problems with choosing to set this scene in India, but it still seemed right to me. And so I put an American there, a young American man, as a visitor to that town when it happens, as a witness and a survivor, because so many people die. And after that, I felt obliged to stick with India. And I felt like if a disaster like this were to happen in India, it's the biggest democracy on earth. It's got a really significant percentage of all the humans on the planet. And along with China, European Union, and the United States, is one of the big powers economically and politically. All that combined to make me think I need to stick with India and see what they would do and try to follow. And this too was dangerous because I've never been to India except for 8 hours in the New Delhi airport waiting for a flight long ago. That's not really there. I have been in the Terai in Nepal for a while, but mainly I'm writing out of what I read. And I've read a lot about India because of my earlier novel, The Years of Rice and Salt. I have an interest. I have Indian friends, many of them working in the United States and in the UK. So between all those things, I decided to follow India through the course of the novel. And I read the India Times and other online Indian media, mostly print, to see what they were saying, to see what Indian English looks like written down, and to follow the news. And as an outsider, nobody can understand other countries, especially big, complicated countries with a long history like India. So it's a bit of a stretch. But I'm a novelist. And as a novelist, I've always committed myself to the idea that you can imagine anybody else's situation and write it down if you take the trouble. So I decided to try.
Well, in any case, I'm very glad that you did, because not only did that strike me as being very realistic, Stan, it conjured the scene of a small town in Uttar Pradesh very, very clearly, and also the precise kind of suffering and how that scenario might play out in that town. You don't spare the rest of the world as the book progresses. And in fact, there's a particularly vivid disaster that befalls California not much later. But the real reason that I'm so glad that you opened with India and put the country front and center is because of what you decided to do with it next. This cataclysm, which in the book kills 20 million people because of the raw heat, this is India's tipping point, and it initiates a climate revolution. And this is something that I feel that many Indians need to see. And we hear a lot in our current conversation about India becoming a world leader again. But it's never really clear what that might be, what we might be leading towards. And the Ministry for the Future provides one kind of surprisingly convincing answer, which is that it struck me in the same way that 75 years ago, India was the country that helped lead the world out of the imperial age and into the post-colonial age. This might be India's moment to help lead the world as the book envisions, out of the world, out of the carbon era into the post-carbon era. And a line that came out of my reading of The Ministry of the Future that stuck with me ever since is that if India's call to leadership in the 20th century was decolonization, then in this century, it's decarbonization. But obviously, this is not, there is not a simple path from where any country stands today into a decarbonized future. And one of the marvelous things about the Ministry of the Future is that it's far from idealistic. It's far from naive about how difficult this path is going to be. One of the obstacles that it deals with is politics, obviously. And in the course of this climate revolution, in many countries, you envision political changes and the electoral defeats of various authoritarian governments, including one in India, before a more democratic climate revolution gets underway. And this made me wonder that is there a basic contradiction between the kind of histrionic nationalism that we see so much of around the world and necessary climate action? And how do you see nationalism figuring in the global climate struggle?
Thank you for this, Raghu, because it's a very important question. We are in a biospheric crisis. The climate crisis is global. It has to do with the planet and the biosphere everywhere. Whatever happens somewhere in the world impacts everywhere in the world. We also live in a nation-state system that is organized in a global capitalist system, but the nation-state system is what I should concentrate on for your question, which is to say, in each nation, a decision could be made. Do we stick with the old ways of us against everybody else, of competitive advantage, of if we do worse, someone else does better, if we do better, someone else does worse? And the nation-state system is like an economic war of all against all. But the crisis is global and has to do with everybody, such that if something bad happens in India, it's bad also in the United States and vice versa. So in the individual countries, there are political leaders that are saying, let's stick to ourselves, let's become nativist, populist, let's fight the war of all against all and try to hold to the old system, which is no longer going to work, because we're all in the same crisis together. So there's a kind of an internationalist global party, and then there's a local nativist party saying, no, let's stick in the past. But we can't stick in the past. So the internationalist parties have to win because we're all in the same crisis together. That's going to be really hard. And the battle there is political. And it's, if you say that it's 50-50 or 51-49, I think in every country, it's a close run thing between the citizens who understand that it's international and the citizens who are made fearful by political leaders and choose to stick with their nation state only. Well, I wrote this book when Donald Trump was president of the United States,
Right.
A populist, nativist fearmonger, if ever there was one. And in 2019, when I wrote it, I was in a dark mood because it looked like he might be reelected. He was not reelected, and this was a great signal of success for sanity and for sticking with the idea that everyone on Earth is in the same boat together. That's just one small victory along the way. We're going to need many more. And I portrayed it happening in India. This is partly a novelist's trick, where you show the good thing happening somewhere else so that you don't have to explain it in detail to an audience that will be skeptical. For an American readership, they could say, oh yes, India, progressive things happened, how nice, I believe it, because nobody knows India from the outside the way Indians know it. Right. So I've been really encouraged that a lot of Indian readers of Ministry for the Future have said, yeah, that could happen. We are in a tight race here also. And recognition of the world situation and of India's ability to leverage progressive positive change by its centrality, its size, its population, its economic power between labor, sunlight, mineral resources, sheer size means that it's not just a novelist's trick. It's also possible that India can be one of the leaders going forward.
Yeah, and also elements of also real elements of India's cultural heritage, its indigenous heritage, and all sorts of peasant communities that I think can and will be ready to be mobilized into climate action as soon as there's a language that surrounds it. Part of the challenge of the climate crisis is an imaginative one, and this is linked to the political challenge, of course. The imaginative crisis is how we can integrate this, the facts that we're hearing, the discomfort that we're feeling into a sense of necessary planetary change, and thinking beyond and thinking of changing everything that will be required, including capitalism itself, as the book makes quite clear. Amitav Ghosh, in his short book, The Great Derangement, gave me the phrase that I know for our inability to take the climate crisis, our present crisis, seriously. But your book, The Ministry for the Future, struck me when I read it as finally being the book that didn't just commit itself to describing the problem convincingly, but also making the solution seem believable. So I'm curious about what this book was like to write for you as a novelist, because, I mean, the power to change this, the novel is famously an individual-centric kind of, immersed in the interior life of one or many characters. And that's not the place where the power to solve this problem exists. And the power to solve this problem doesn't exist in the form of a superhero. It's cumulative, it's incremental, it involves bureaucracies, it involves research processes, it involves very complex financial engineering, no doubt. And you have rolled up your sleeve and you have gotten deep into some of those with real technical rigor. And that is not something that novelists generally do, is try to summarize systems at that scale and the kind of arc of both time and labor that's involved in this kind of story. This is a different kind of story. What was it like for you to engage with as a novelist?
It presented a formal challenge. The form of the novel is luckily very capacious and wide-ranging. And Amitav Ghosh is a fine novelist, but he also is a conventional novelist, following the old rules that you stay inside the lives of a few characters, and by expressing them fully, the singular might represent the general. Which is true. And there are excellent examples of that kind of novel illuminating a whole society. Ghosh himself has written some. For me, the spectacular novel of illuminating India would be Vikram Seth, A Suitable Boy, a tremendous novel in the classic style.
Right.
But where Ghosh made his mistake, and I regard it as a fundamental mistake, was he put down science fiction, and science fiction is a power that he doesn't recognize. And of course, I am a science fiction writer, so I'm sensitive on this point. He relegated it to the outhouse of literature, and a famous phrase. But for me, science fiction is actually the realism of our time, because our civilization is overdetermined by scientific progress and developments that make it possible for 8 billion people to live on this planet at once. And also science fiction is set in the future, so that you can describe things that are starting now, but are not yet fully developed. And so the power of science fiction is the power of prophecy and the power of metaphor, in that it feels like I'm turning into a robot. It feels like time is speeding up. These are science fiction ideas, but they express our feelings right now. So there's an immense power in the novel, and there's an immense power in science fiction novels, in particular for now. For me and the Ministry for the Future, the formal device that solved it for me and made it possible to make a planetary novel, as you call it, was the eyewitness account. There must be 40 eyewitness accounts in Ministry for the Future, anonymous voices saying, I saw this, I saw that, I took part in this event. And they're often not even named. But what's important to point out is the eyewitness account is a genre of its own that is not the same as the novel. It doesn't set the scene. It doesn't dramatize scenes. It tells you in summary form. It's telling, not showing. And I always love it when that cliche rule of show, don't tell is overturned, because it's all telling in the end. And to tell at speed something that happened to you years before and judge it, this is a powerful genre, the eyewitness account. So these are fictional eyewitness accounts of future events, but it gave me my method. And along with many other forms, I made the Ministry for the Future the kind of a novel that is a grab bag. And it has a conventional novel as its spine, the story of Mary and Frank and Badim, the Indian Nepali character that is running the ministry's dark wing. And we don't know what Badim does, what he authorizes. So the reader becomes a detective to understand or to try to imagine Badim's plot on their own, which is a nice trick also. So this is how I put it all together. And the writing of it was in 2019, which means the timeline I projected is all wrong. Everything's happening faster than I wrote in Ministry. So the dates are all wrong, but that doesn't matter. I think the feel of it is still right as to the sense of crisis and us responding to it. Now, I did make it a best case scenario. The response in my novel is to, despite all turmoil and resistance, to succeed in dealing with climate change. And that's why I'm talking to you. That's why the book has become famous, which I can say with some surprise that it is indeed now a famous novel, because there is no, if you want a positive story about the future, there's not very many alternatives. And so you turn to Ministry for the Future for lack of a burgeoning a collection of novels like it, which I presume will follow.
I completely agree. I had never, I think it might have been the first formulation of what you called, a phrase you coined, our path to the good Anthropocene. The good Anthropocene is your phrase, and it stuck with me because it's very clear to us that that the Anthropocene is upon us, that temperatures are going to rise, and that we are going to see planetary, climate disruption on a scale that we can't even predict yet. The question is, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the signs that we won't be able to cope with that. But if we do, what is it going to look like? And this book, which is yay big, is packed with, I thought I could feel your restlessness, your impatience to run across the planet, touching on all the different sources of solutions and sources of hope that do exist, that are in development. It's like it felt like your fundamental aim was to invigorate readers with this vision of an abundance of possibilities, of social alliances, of scientific possibilities, of dark wing radical flank operations, of wonky policy strategies, all coming together and succeeding not in stopping climate change, but in creating an Anthropocene in which we live, in which human society is still granted a good existence rather than a catastrophic one. And I think that is something that the world needed. It's something I needed to see. So having said this, I want to ask you what I hope is not a trivial question, which is, which one was your favorite? You must have spent a fair amount of time dwelling on each of these, whether it's the development of the carbon coin, which is too complex for me to try and explain here, or manually restoring the polar ice caps by pumping water out of the outflowing ice melt back onto the top of the polar ice caps, or massive non-state drone attacks on oil infrastructure and oil tankers, or even just kidnapping billionaires. I mean, who doesn't want to see a couple of billionaires being kidnapped non-violently? Is there a particular one that stuck in your imagination because of, for whatever reason?
Yes, and thank you. I did indeed, when you talked about me hustling through all kinds of topics, it's true. I wanted the novel to feel like a juggler act or like a tabla drummer. The speed of change, every scene only 2-3 pages long, was part of the pleasure of the book. So if you think of this novel as being kind of a grim or a topic of great seriousness, where's the pleasure in it as a novel reader? Because the novel is ultimately about pleasure of imagination. The pleasure would be in the speed of the ideas pouring through the text. And then to get to the one that let's say this, the one that's most important is indeed the carbon coin, which I can describe very simply as Keynesian economics.
Right.
And as government leading the economy rather than the market leading the economy. Government seizes the economy by making money in the first place, which it already does. Government-backed money is the only real money. These cryptocurrencies are just games played in the developed world to speculate. They're like Dutch tulips in the 17th century, a speculative bubble and useless as power in the world. They're games on the margin. Real money is fiat money made by central banks. And here again, India is important because it's big, and it could actually quantitatively ease the situation in India without losing the stability of its own money. All the biggest central banks combine to back a carbon coin, which is simply quantitative easing, like we saw in America in 2008, and everybody saw in the pandemic in 2020. The creation of new money by fiat, by the central banks, real money, that is first spent on decarbonization, and then it flows into the economy normally. This is straightforward Keynesian economics, where government leads business. And we have been in neoliberal economics, where the market overwhelmed government, and government served only the market. If government tries to avoid the climate catastrophe, government will have to serve the people, not the market and the top 1% or the top 15%. So this carbon coin is possible. I'm happy to report the central banks themselves are discussing it. It's not just an idea in a science fiction novel. It is a worldwide community of discussants, including, you can look this up, the Network for Greening the Financial System. That would be NGFS. Well, these are the central banks themselves. This is not just a think tank. This is the 89 of the biggest central banks on earth talking together about how to green finance, which is a way of talking about the carbon coin. If the governments pay people, and in India, this is very important, you've got a gigantic labor pool there that could do the work of a quick transition to clean energy. And India's got a lot of sunlight and a lot of resources and a lot of labor power and a lot of money. As because it is a capitalist power as well as a big physical space. Now, as an American leftist, I say in India, if you're interested to know how India appears as a literary artifact, as an intellectual artifact to the rest of the world, Kerala in the Southwest, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Kerala, I always said.
Kerala, you had it right the first time, yeah.
Yeah. This is famous worldwide for its leftist government and its power to the people, the panchayat system. Sikkim is famous around the world for its commitment to organic regenerative agriculture. There are leading intellectual movements that come out of India, maybe out of the corners rather than the mainstream, but in any case, they are India. And it's in India where those ideas could be uptaked fastest because they're indigenous. And yet they're also instructive to the rest of the world that's paying attention. So everything combines to where my favorite idea in the book was that we could pay ourselves to do the good work rather than the bad work. And this is transformative.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense. I want to highlight this for all of the Bitcoin bros out there. You could spare some of your hours to pay attention to the carbon coin if you want to know what really is the future direction for international finance. But I do want to pick up on what you were just saying, Stan, because while on the one hand the book details re-engineering of the world economy like the carbon coin, on the other hand, when you look at places like India, you name and you roll call dozens of real existing organizations that are doing the work and making advances in regenerative agriculture, water harvesting, reforestation. And it felt to me, I really appreciated this. There is one chapter which is simply a roll call of organizations around the world. And it felt to me like you were passing the mic in a manner of speaking. You were saying, well, I've outlined and in fact detailed all of these policy possibilities, but there's also there's this horizon of real organizations and people who have other ideas, who have more, who are on the ground doing things. And was that your intention? I mean, were you sort of were you gesturing at the real world of expertise that is out there so close to the ground? So many of these organizations in India.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a real list. It's chapter 85 of Ministry. In the audio book, it takes about 15 minutes, and it's voices that have, the novel being in English, the voices are saying they're from the various countries of the world doing ecological work. This is from a Google map. These are all real organizations. And they, the way that the Google map was organized by the people who put it together in a volunteer basis was to go to YouTube and find ecological organizations around the world that had posted a YouTube video about themselves. So in other words, it's only representative of what must be a much, much longer list of organizations doing good work already. And a lot of them are in India, which in an ecological sense is just one of the great spaces on the earth, and a chance for the various kinds of landscape restoration, wildlife protection, and the putting aside of some space for the survival of all of our other cousin species. The potential in India is huge. So in the audio book of Ministry, the voices are speaking all of the different kinds of English that exist because of the because of the success of the British Empire, followed by the success of the American economic empire. English has become the lingua franca, as you know, for the world. And so the range of voices in this chapter for the different countries is quite a beautiful display of solidarity. I mean, language is indeed a problem. There needs to be local, we need to have all the languages, the thousands of languages survive, but it is useful, and it's a historical artifact that both India and the United States are post-colonial to the British Empire, and therefore we all share English as a way to communicate. I've sat next to a Norwegian talking to someone from Poland, and their countries are only 200 kilometers apart. They had to speak English to each other, and this happens everywhere. So we have this common language, which means that we can all talk, and this is probably important for the global effort. And yes, those ecological organizations, they already exist. They're quite local, but they share a global ideology and perspective and ethos that we have to save this earth by human efforts all across the board.
Yes, they do. In fact, I have to The last time we've spoken once before, I interviewed you a couple of months ago because we were on the verge of COP26, which was the large climate conference that was going to define the next step that the international community would take towards mitigating carbon in our economies. At the time, I was interviewing you for an essay that I did write for the New Yorker, which explored in depth the Ministry for the Future's treatment of India and how it tapped all of these somewhat forgotten, hidden sentiments that do exist in this country about our potential for this kind of world leadership. And soon after that, some of that was put to the test at COP26 itself. And you were there. I would love to know, since this is the first time we're speaking since then, what COP26 was like for you as an experience. I suppose it goes without saying from the outset that it must have been a mixed experience in terms of its outcomes. But what was it like to actually be there, and did it leave you feeling like some of these solutions might be on the table?
Yes, I think they are. COP26 was two of the most intense weeks of my life, without a doubt. It was overwhelming, and I left stunned and confused. There were 40,000 people there in the city to meet and talk behind a militarized zone of protection. So it was strange, but it was international, diplomats from everywhere. For me personally, what was rather spectacular was that many people there had read The Ministry for the Future, and it was something they had shared amongst themselves. A novel about diplomats managing to save the world is popular amongst diplomats for obvious reasons. And so people wanted to talk to me and explain more. Things I had gotten wrong, things where me knowing more would help me in my next book, etc. And also people who just appreciated the book for its positive message. As for COP itself, I admire it tremendously. We need it. It is necessary, but not sufficient.
Right.
I was invited by the UK government, who were the hosts. So they gave me a badge that allowed me to go into the negotiating sessions themselves, where the diplomats were arguing over the wording of the agreement that would come out. And I mean word by word, comma by comma. For an hour, I watched 30 people argue about whether the data should be presented in rows or in columns. And it was important. And for a writer, that's kind of beautiful to see language. Language might become power. It might become law. And that's what they were arguing. And more than half of them were women, young women. The actual negotiators were 60% young women lawyers and diplomats. Very cheerful, very serious, very meticulous. That too was beautiful to see, because the important spokespeople often turn out to be men, but the work in the negotiating sessions was largely being done by women. I found that striking. Then the results, well, it's a consensus model, which is bizarre. Every country has to agree to every word, or else it doesn't go forward. So it's naturally cautious and slow. And yet it also has a rule. Every year, everybody has to try to do better. A ratcheting system where the promises that you made one year, you are enjoined to make better by the next year. And so progress is a very slow, but very steady. And I came away both impressed and frightened, because it won't be enough. We have a problem that COP can't do it by itself because of its slowness and its caution. The rest of the world, all those little organizations like in Chapter 85, all of us as individuals are going to have to press our politicians from below to speed the process up. And so it was a very mixed feeling coming away from Glasgow, knowing these new things, to be both more encouraged and more frightened at the same time. I still haven't sorted it out. I don't know if I ever will. Maybe we're all in that same boat. It's a frightening situation, but there are reasons for hope, because it's the main issue on everybody's table right now. Essentially, history of the 21st century is, can civilization deal with the climate crisis successfully? And it better, or else we'll fall apart into disarray and mass catastrophe. But if we get it together and cooperate as a global community, we could indeed get to a very exciting place of prosperity for all, of safety for all of the creatures on the planet. All the good things that you speak of in utopian literature are still within our grasp if we act quickly in the 2020s. So this was a stunning experience, Glasgow.
Well, the note you just said about what will be required of us and what is possible for us in the 2020s, I'm not going to be able to end on a better note than that. So I will just say that as a manual for the 2020s, for many of us, we're not going to be able to do much better than the Ministry of the Future. It's packed with ideas. It's also packed with inspiration, which is exactly the effect it had on me. Thank you very much, Stan. And I encourage everyone to, well, this problem isn't going away. So your opportunity to pick this book up won't be going away either. Thanks, Stan.
Thank you, Raghu. And I hope to meet you and all your colleagues in person at the Jaipur Literary Festival at some future date. I really hope that happens.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you, Kim Stanley Robinson and Raghu Karnad, for that captivating session. This session was part of the Urgency of Borrowed Time series. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Do stay tuned to continue to watch our wonderful sessions and the JLF Writers Shorts, all of which have been specially curated for you.